Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today on Wednesday, the 28th of July, 2021. For those who don't know me, my name is Clinton Drell, Managing Director of On Demand HR. We often put on webinars for very topical items such as this. Obviously, there's been significant disruption in business over the past 4 to 5 weeks in New South Wales. Obviously, some challenging times for businesses. We've been working very closely with our members to guide them through these times, and obviously now we want to provide an opportunity of certainly giving back to our accounting network and obviously other businesses that want to know more about some of the, learnings of the last few weeks, some of the challenges. I'd also like to introduce you to our operations manager, Andrew Kalina, who's also on the line. Andrew has been with us for the best part of a year and a half now. He's our expert when it comes to government-related announcements and technical aspects of these various different things. So I'll just get Andrew just to quickly say hello to the group before we get started.
Yeah, hello everybody. I guess just like all of you, one of the challenges that we've found in recent times as advisors in this space is trying to learn and become on top of all these changes in regulations and eligibility and business support methods at the same time as our clients. So it's definitely challenging times that we've experienced, but I'll do my best to add any insights that I possibly can.
Yeah, thanks very much, Andrew, for that. I'm assuming that everyone can see the presentation that we'll cover today. That should be all up on the screen in front of you. If you've got any questions throughout, please feel free to ask them. Andrew will answer some of the questions on the chat. I'll also take some of the questions on the live discussion as well. Good to see a good turnout for this one as well. So really appreciate you coming on for this. I'm sorry to take you away from your daily dose of nonsense from the New South Wales government that's also on at 11 o'clock today, but I'm not expecting anything significant to come out of that other than probably an extension of the time. So I don't think any of the technicals will really change. So hopefully we'll be able to provide you with something a lot more interesting than the Premier will. So we'll get through these key points today, and we might make a start. Actually, we've got well over 30 people on the line. We're expecting a few more, but let's get stuck into it. So today's presentation is going to be about JobSaver and the lockdown workplace relations challenges. So in our presentation today, we're going to cover the following topics. We're going to cover the workplace relations challenges. We're going to try and make sense of some of the lockdown restrictions for business. Now, bear in mind, we've had various scenarios that we've been working on in the past 4 weeks, so we'll be able to share some knowledge and insight into those things. We're going to cover New South Wales business support, employment considerations. Andrew will probably talk a little bit about eligibility, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of the WR challenges that we can see this is going to bring about. Questions and answers throughout, guys. We love these to be interactive, so please shoot us any questions throughout. If we don't get to any of your questions or you don't feel the question's been adequately answered during the session, you can always email us at advice@ondemandhr.com.au. I think probably 3 guiding principles out of today's discussions is that the first thing I think that businesses should take the attitude with these restrictions is, and also how to approach things like JobSaver, is I think forgiveness, not permission. Sure, I think that what we look at in these situations is often what we can't do, but I think we should be more focused on trying to look at what we can do and trying to work within the limits of both the restrictions for the purposes of our employees, but also working within the limits of what we think may be allowed under these particular JobSaver rules as well. So that's probably the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that I think it's important for businesses to be continuing to just make decisions and get on with life through all of this. I don't think businesses should be delaying decisions because they're unsure about restrictions. And I really want to encourage businesses to not fall into this trap of being complacently compliant. So what we sometimes hear with businesses is that they're sort of, they're not sure, and they think, I might not be able to do this, so I just won't do it. And unfortunately, in these times, I mean, there's some businesses that are obviously doing it really tough at the moment, and this is the second lockdown they've had following on from the lockdowns from last year. So they may not be in the financial position to just be complacently compliant. So we'll talk about some of those scenarios a little bit later on in the session. I'll give you an idea. We've navigated some of those challenging scenarios for the members that we work with. So yeah, so that's certainly what we will look at throughout today's session. I think I just want to cover, to start off with, some of the real headline workplace relations challenges. So probably the biggest challenge that we face this time around is that we've got these lockdowns in New South Wales. We've also got some in other states as well. Victoria, I think Queensland, and Australia is even got something in the mix as well, even though they've had 1 or 2 cases. But basically, the biggest challenge we've got is that Section 789 of the Fair Work Act, that was a temporary measure that was put in place by the government last year. And what that section allowed is it allowed businesses to essentially reduce employees' hours without agreement. There was a number of other things. That was the main power that was given to employers to reduce employee hours without agreement. Those provisions ended at the end of March 2021, and you've kind of got to wonder why the logic was to end them at that particular time. Yes, it was attached to JobKeeper, but to think that there was never going to be another a lockdown in Australia, particularly with the attitude of these hyperactive and premiers that we've got, was pretty naive. And now we've got a situation which is quite unfortunate, where businesses don't have the ability to simply reduce hours without agreement. They have to basically seek agreement to reduce hours, or alternatively, they have to go down this path of a Section 524, which is what I call the all or nothing stand down, which is basically you've either got enough work, or you're continuing work with your employees as normal, or you've got zero work and they're completely stood down. And as we all appreciate, look, a lot of businesses in this situation are just not cut out, and those situations are just simply not that black and white. I mean, to give you an example, we've got a client that's in the meat industry. They have a situation where obviously some of their clients can be serviced and a lot of their clients can't. So they've got people who need to work some hours, but not necessarily all of their hours. I might take a question. It talks about here with regard to the Service New South Wales Micro Business Grant, how to prove 30% decline in turnover lockdown period does not align with BAS reporting period. I might kick that one off to you, Andrew. If you could answer that one in the chat for Joseph, that would be great. Happy for you to take that one. I might go back to the slide and continue to cover the content. So what we have is a situation now where if you are wanting to reduce hours, you're going to have to do it by agreement, because you don't have the provisions of Section 789 that you did have last year to reduce hours unilaterally. So what we the positioning for this, I think, in most businesses would simply be to say this, is that number one, we are either going to stand you down completely because we don't have enough work for you to do, unless there is an ability for us to agree on reduced hours. And I think that when Section 524 stand downs were written into the Fair Work Act, we virtually saw no use of it whatsoever for about 10 years. And then we saw so many different uses for it in the last 18 months. I mean, we've had the fires, we've had the floods, we've had COVID-19. I mean, there's so many reasons that businesses have stood down employees without pay for reasons which are out of the control of the employer ultimately. So that is something that businesses will continue to need to do, and that is to negotiate reduced hours by agreement with employees. The other narrative that you can always say in those situations is that ultimately, if employees are not agreeable to reducing their hours, well, then the other thing you should be really saying to the employees is, well, look, that might force us into a restructuring situation, which could trigger redundancies. Now, for some employees, that might be welcome news because it means payouts. But for others, particularly in businesses of less than 15 employees, obviously there's no redundancy pay that's automatic in less than 15 employee businesses. In fact, in most small businesses, there isn't redundancy pay. So that could be sometimes the catalyst for employees to get on board with the mutual agreement to reduce hours. So that's another tip on that. The other thing that we're hearing a lot about is that businesses are being asked by their employees to provide guidance on the individual support, and look, that is a really challenging one. We had a situation with a client. Last week where they actually had a situation where they wanted to actually pay their employees the difference between what the government was going to give them, the $600, and obviously what their normal wage was going to be. So it was really, really tricky around this because we're thinking, well, how do we pay this? Do we pay 18 hours, which means that they've lost 20 hours or more, and then the government will obviously kick in the $600? But then what if the pay rate, or what if the total amount of pay for that 18 hours is not the difference? How do we get around in that situation? So yeah, look, there's some really challenging scenarios like that. The other one is annual leave, the use of annual leave. We still don't have clarity on whether or not annual leave counts for the purposes of hours worked, for the purposes of these disaster payments. So there's two arguments on the annual leave. You could argue that annual leave replaces work, and that's normally the notion when you're talking about things such as, superannuation, accruals of leave, and things like that. But there's another argument. The other argument is that, well, if it wasn't for this particular period of time and these restrictions imposed by the New South Wales government, I wouldn't have lost the hours, which would have meant I wouldn't have needed to take the leave. So there's that argument as well. And we still don't have clarity on that. Andrew, was there anything additional you wanted to say on that particular point?
Not so much. I think you really reasonably covered that. Was there anything that you thought that was additional?
No, not really. I might take a question, actually. I've got a question here from Simon. Thanks very much for asking it. If we have some staff who work part of their hours in an area that is shut down due to restrictions and the rest of their hours in an area which they are still able to work, are we able to stand them down on reduced hours? Well, yeah, that kind of goes back to what we said before about Section 789 no longer exists. So any reduction of hours either needs to be part working hours, part leave, or simply a reduction of hours by mutual agreement. So that could be, half the amount of hours and, unpaid leave, topping up the balance. So the challenge is that, as I said, it has to be by agreement. So going specifically to your question, you're talking about that some staff work part of their hours in area that's shut down, others where it's still able to work. So in your situation, I would imagine you've probably lost half of those hours, or let's say, roughly half of those hours. So no, you're not able to stand them down and reduce hours. You would need to agree to mutually reduce the hours, agree for them to take leave for the balance, or agree that they will, effectively, work reduced hours, get the government payment for the loss of hours. So bear in mind the 20 hours or more. So it might be convenient for you to have them working 18 and not working 20, because then they get the maximum payment available from the government. So Simon's is a perfect example of why the workplace relations response to this has been completely inadequate from the government. And I've been very, very critical that, if these premiers want to lock down our states at the drop of a hat, which is what they are notorious for doing, then there has to be the industrial relations flexibility in order to do this. And quite frankly, Christian Porter should be taking up these reforms in the parliament. And if the Labor Party and the Greens are not prepared to vote for them, well, quite frankly, the premiers that sit in those states, in those various Labor states, should not be locking down the states. It's as simple as that. It's got to be one or the other. You either give them the IR flexibilities to adapt to these situations because of these drop of a hat lockdowns, or you go the other way and just say, look, there's not going to be any more lockdowns, because you can't have it both ways. Let's have a look. Another question here. Can we pay 2 days' wages to top up $600 claim by employees? So thank you for your question, Diane, on that. So basically, look, as far as we can see, it's 20 hours or more. So effectively, if you're paying 16 hours or 18 hours, then that would you would qualify, we think you would qualify for the maximum amount of government payment because it's 20 hours or more. So ultimately, if your hours are 18 or 16, that should qualify you for the maximum payment. Got a question here from another, this one is from, the computer is just, got a question here. This is a good one from Peter. Hi, Peter. Thanks for joining us. Employees who can't work because of being in a restricted LGA and cannot work from home, can they be stood down or asked to use the annual leave? So what you've actually described, Peter, this is a very common one, by the way, everyone. So Peter is asking here about an employee who can't work from home and is in a restricted LGA. There's 5 LGAs at the moment, I believe, that are restricted. It's Fairfield, Liverpool, Canterbury Bankstown, Cumberland, and I think it's Blacktown is the other one. So that's the 5 LGAs restricted. And essentially, what we have here is a scenario where the employees can't get to work. The work can't be done from home. That's actually the default position on that one is unpaid pandemic leave. So think about in these situations, you've got to think about who has the problem. Is it the employee that has the problem that they can't get to work, or the employer has the problem that they can't provide work? So that's the first question you ask yourself in respect to these situations. Does the employee have the problem, or does the employer have the problem? So that's an important distinction to make. So in that scenario, Peter, you described, it's unpaid pandemic leave. If an employee wants to apply for leave, then that's fine, but they should not be given personal leave in those situations if they are not sick. So generally speaking, they'd be applying for annual leave in that scenario. So thank you for that question, Peter. A very common one we've found from clients. Adrian, thank you for your comment about that. The IR Minister, I've got to say I missed that in the last few weeks, so thank you for correcting me on that. Does this include working directors? This is a good point. Andrew, I might have you look into that question from Diane about working directors, whether they are eligible for such payments. We now have another 3 LGAs restricted. That's thank you very much, Nina, for that. We will obviously pick that up. I anticipate those 3 LGAs will also be similar restrictions to the others. And then we've got a question here from Judy regarding JobSaver for employing businesses. Maintain your employee headcount on the 13th of July. Please clarify headcount. So yes, stand down employees do count. They do count, Judy, and I'll actually cover the rest of this in the next slide. So we will get to that very shortly. Okay. So another key workplace relations challenge that we are finding is that there's been a few scenarios where out-of-hours conduct has actually arisen, or problems with out-of-hours conduct has arisen, which impacts on work. I've got 2 recent examples of this. One where an employee went from Mudgee to Sydney, to Wollongong, got fined in Wollongong for breaching COVID orders, and then obviously went back to Mudgee. And then the question was, because Mudgee was out in the regional areas, what sort of action should the employer take in this situation? So the 2 recommendations we made was, well, first and foremost, the employee going back from that greater Sydney area, which includes Wollongong, back to regional New South Wales, first and foremost, they have to adhere to the stay-at-home orders. So even though everyone in that Mudgee area can go and do things as normal, the employee who went into Greater Sydney cannot. They have to adhere to the stay-at-home orders. So the stay-at-home orders means obviously they can only leave for essential shopping, exercise, those sorts of things, but not just to go and fraternise in the general public. We had another situation where employee went to Sydney from the Hunter, went back to the Hunter, but then couldn't come to work because they have to adhere to the stay-at-home orders, and the work had to be done. Well, the work could be done from home. So in that situation, kind of the employer was sort of forced to kind of allow the employee to work from home in this situation because of the stay-at-home orders that come into effect because they came to Sydney. The other twist in that situation was the employee also then during the stay-at-home orders back in the Hunter breached the stay-at-home orders. So the employer actually said, well, you've clearly clearly breached the stay-at-home orders. And it's a tough one because sometimes even if they breach the stay-at-home orders, those are not necessarily matters that are connected to the employment. They can be matters connected to the employment. They might not be. So you probably saw, I think it was yesterday, there was an employee who was suspended for attending the march on the weekend. And again, I'm not sure why the employer would suspend an employee in that situation, because it's not a matter that's connected to employment. And yeah, it'd be a very long bow to suggest that it was. So even if employees do effectively breach stay-at-home orders or do things that are outside of the stay-at-home orders, it doesn't necessarily mean the employer can take action. So that's been a really interesting thing. In terms of employees refusing reasonable management action, so another issue we've seen is that employees are concerned about QR coding in workplaces. They don't want to have their every move recorded. To be quite honest, I don't particularly like QR codes myself, but I would say that if the one place it doesn't really matter where you QR code, it's your employer, because the tax office knows where you work anyway. So I'm not sure why there's any concern of logging in at your employer's premises. So we have had that situation though with a couple of employees of clients, and that is a reasonable directive that employers can enforce. So obviously employers are required to have QR coding on their workplaces at the moment, whether you like it or not. But ultimately, that is the rule, and it is a reasonable directive for employers to expect that to be followed. And I would agree with you, Jitesh, that it's absolute COVID nonsense that we are seeing. Let's continue to move through. We've now got, so this is the criteria that I want everyone to think about when they're considering whether their employee can come to work or not, okay? So let's work through this. And when I say come to work at the premises. Okay, so anyone, work from home, anyone can do that, obviously. This is really a criteria we've prepared for people thinking about whether they can come to work at a premises. So the first question you ask yourself is the business able to be open? Okay, that's the easiest question. It's not on the closed businesses list. So if the business is not on the closed businesses list, then the second question you've got to ask yourself is, can the work be reasonably carried out at home? Now, this is an interesting one. The government initially kind of came out with language of, can it be reasonably done at home? Then they went to employers must allow employees to work at home. And now it seems like they've changed it back again to reasonably. So, I mean, and this is just my absolute criticism of the government in this regard, is that we've had COVID now for the best part of 15 months, and the fact that the government can't work out when an employee can and can't work from home, they keep changing language. What's an essential worker? What's a restricted LGA when their testing is? What sort of businesses do we close down in a stage 1, 2, 3 lockdown? It's absolutely preposterous that they still haven't worked this stuff out, and it seems like they're just doing this on the run. And you'd almost have to argue that, I don't want to be cynical, but you'd almost have to argue that this is just, they're almost deliberately trying to be confusing. It's very disappointing leadership, and hopefully we can see better in the months ahead, because up to date it's been very, very confusing. And even we've had situations where on Saturday we'll be looking at the rules for clients, and then on Sunday we're ringing back the same clients telling them that the rules have changed. 2 weeks ago, for example, we had a situation where the New South Wales government said you can't leave your LGA unless you are a health worker or an emergency worker. So we rang everyone on Saturday saying, sorry guys, all these employees in these areas can't leave. Then the very next day, there's another 10 different categories of authorised workers, which just got added to the New South Wales Service website. So that just gives you I don't want to rant about this too much, but that just gives you the context of some of the madness we've seen in the decision-making on this and the incompetence of government in getting this right. Let's keep going back to, though, the restriction. So can the work be reasonably carried out from home? And my view is that you've got to have a connection to the site. So the work is a situation, has to be connected to the site. It has to be a scenario where, they either work in manufacturing, or they work in warehousing, or they're working something that's physically connected to the site. I don't think it's a strong enough reason that you simply haven't got the computer systems at home, or the telephone line is at home. I don't think that's a good enough reason to deal with or to say that the work can't be reasonably carried out at home. So anyway, that's my thoughts on point 2. Then we get to point 3. Is the employee an essential worker? What even is an essential worker? And the truth of the matter is that the term essential worker actually kind of has no real, it doesn't actually have any bearing in the situation. The more correct term is authorised worker. Authorised worker we'll get to in point 6. Essential worker has just kind of been this term that's been, again, bandied around by government, but it's not actually defined because we actually revert back to authorised worker in this situation, and we'll get to what exactly that means going forward. So the third question, so is the business able to be open? Let's say it's a yes. Can the work be reasonably carried out at home? Let's say it's no. They have to come to the office. So then, does the employee live in an impacted LGA? And then if the answer to that is yes, then unpaid pandemic leave. If the answer to that is no, they can come to work. Is the work, the other question is the work carried outside of an impacted LGA? So an employee who is who lives in an affected LGA and works within the same LGA, they don't actually necessarily need to be an authorised worker to go to work, because as long as the business is open and as long as the work can't be done from home, they can still go to work. So it's only if you have to leave the impacted LGA to get to work rule comes into play. So within the same LGA is fine. I'll give you a client that's in the meat industry, and they have a situation where they are in the Canterbury Bankstown LGA. They had employees who lived in the Canterbury Bankstown LGA, so they could come to work at the premises. The work couldn't be done from home. But then they've got a situation where they've got deliveries that need to be driven outside of the Bankstown LGA, the Canterbury Bankstown LGA. So basically what they have to do, and this just gives you the absurdity of some of the rules, that employees who lived within the Bankstown LGA could come into the workplace with all the other employees, pack and prepare and put into the truck the orders, but then you've got to get a driver who lives outside of the Bankstown LGA to come inside the Bankstown LGA to work, to then take deliveries back outside of the Bankstown LGA. So if you're not already confused with that, then if you're following all of that, and if that makes sense, then great. If you're confused, well, that's completely understandable. But again, that's a scenario where the impact of the LGA matters. There was a real life scenario we had there with that client a couple of weeks ago, which and then to add something even more interesting to that, then they'd stood down some employees, had an employee tested positive for COVID, then they had to stand down, or they had to isolate all the other employees and then bring back all of the employees that was like the B team to replace the employees that had been isolating. So very interesting times for that client in the last couple of weeks. Got a question here from Jitesh around, we want to get to a point where we can access over the next few weeks whether our staff are vaccinated. So far, we've sent out anonymous surveys. Can we ask same on non-anonymous surveys? What else can we do to push forward? Can we access rapid test kits that we have that we can have non-vaccinated staff take daily? Well, I think that what we are talking about here is we're talking about making decisions that are outside of the scope of what the government requires. And at the moment, as I understand it, the government requires certain industries to be vaccinated. I've always issued caution to employers in going beyond that unless it impacts upon, unless it's a knock-on effect requirement from clients that they provide services to. So, for example, if I'm providing services to a quarantine hotel and the quarantine hotel requires suppliers or delivery drivers to be vaccinated, then that would be a basis for seeking vaccination. I'm reluctant to advise any client or any business to, at this particular point in time, demand their employees vaccinate if they do not require it to do business. Now, sure, if employees choose to do that of their own volition, that's completely fine. But once it starts becoming an employer request, and if that's not a mandatory requirement in that industry, you are potentially buying into things such as workers' compensation. So, for example, if an employee was required to be vaccinated by their employer, and if they had an adverse reaction to that vaccine, then that may I wouldn't even say may very well, could very well be a workers' compensation claim, particularly if they weren't otherwise intending on being vaccinated. I don't think there's anything wrong with an employer encouraging people to be vaccinated in general terms and even facilitating employees to be optionally vaccinated. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But in terms of making it an inherent requirement of the role, that should only be done if it is needed. And again, I think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in that regard. So that's going to be a very interesting space ahead. And obviously, there's strong views on both sides of this. But I've said all along, I wouldn't be doing any more than the government requires at this particular point. I think that if you take that position, then I think that's a safer position than going it alone and requiring more of your employees, because then I think you're buying into some of the risk associated with that. So that is ultimately, that's just some thoughts on that. Back to the test. So essentially, we've then got, is the work carried outside of impacted LGA? Is the employee an authorised worker? So obviously there's an authorised worker list that people within impacted LGAs, which there's now another 3, according to one of our participants on this today, then you'll only be able to leave those impacted LGAs if you're an authorised worker. And the authorised worker, there's I think about 11 industries where there's a whole bunch of subcategories in that as well. So again, you can leave the area if you fall into one of those categories. So I think the important thing to note, though, is that I think the worker has to be authorised, not just the industry. So you can't just, I don't think you can justify bringing in a whole bunch of office staff just because you run a warehouse. So warehousing is included in the authorised worker list. But I don't think that gives you the licence to bring in all of your office workers as well, unless, of course, they have a direct connection to that warehouse. Sure, if they're an inventory controller, then yes, you could argue that that's a connection to the website. So a connection to the site, should I say. Let me go to a couple of other questions here. Diane, a question about employee claims $600 for the Monday to Friday this week. Will the payment received for 3 days from last week be included as income this week? I might get Andrew, if you could take that one for me, mate, that would be great. We have our production staff coming in, but provided off-start option to work from home. That's good, Jitesh. That makes sense. That makes absolute sense. Okay, so we'll keep going through. Look, the other thing is here, we spoke about that meat industry one. The other one that I think businesses are grappling with is, again, the authorised worker list is still vague, and there is some businesses that are making commercial decisions about this, whether or not, a $10,000 fine is an acceptable risk, whether they're just saying to their employees, look, we are authorising you to go. We're giving you a letter to say that you're authorised to do this work. And look, the way I see it, I don't know that police, unless it's clear cut, I don't know how that police are necessarily going to be able to be definitive in making these fines and giving penalties, because what are they going to do? They're going to turn up to a site and say, well, you're not authorised to work. And there's so many arguments that can be made for and against that I don't even know that the police can make a definitive call on that. I think what you'll see a lot of is probably warnings and telling people that they can't do it, but not necessarily fines. That would be my guess. There was, even in the early stages, there was some feedback I had about a travel agent in Auburn who apparently had to process a whole bunch of refunds. Was told by the police to close down. Obviously wasn't fined, but they argued, well, we had to be in the office to process all of these refunds because no one can go anywhere now. In that situation, that probably, you could argue that sort of business probably isn't work that has to be done from an office. But again, only police saying, look, get out of here and we're not going to fine you. So that might be the approach they take. It's very hard to say, but that's kind of what we've seen so far. Just looking at I'll move on to the next slide now. So let's talk about the business support introduction. So we've got here the support available at 40% of the weekly payroll. I won't cover this in too much depth. A lot of the accountants on this are really good at this stuff. So I'm just going to cover the basics of this, and then I'm going to get into the workplace relations considerations of this, which came to one of the questions asked before by Judy. 40% of weekly payroll, it's paid in arrears. Apparently the start date for this is 18th of July. The weekly minimum is 1,500. The maximum is 10,000, although we have someone on the chat saying here, another update from today's press conference, the JobSaver program has been extended from a maximum of 10K to 100K. So there you go. That's another change that's just come into effect. We've got eligibility, the annual turnover, it's 75,000 to 50 million, 30% turnover reduction for a 2-week period from the 26th of June 21 to 30 July 2021 compared to the same period in 2019. Now, we've used the word selected there because presumably you can select what 2-week period you want to use for the purposes of this, for the purposes of eligibility. Apparently, GST method will be the method of calculating turnover. You'll have to maintain your employee headcount as of 13th of June. We will get onto that in the next slide. That's going to be probably the main subject of our next slide and the key points to make. Obviously, consult with your accountant to assist with the application, many of which are on the line today. So I trust all of you guys are around the details, so I won't spend too much on the money side of things on that front. Let's get into the workplace relations part of this. So employee headcount. First of all, we must nominate an employee headcount on application. The count includes full-time, part-time, and casuals over 12 months. So regular and systematic casuals. And that kind of lines up with the Fair Work Act amendments that we've recently had, whereby casuals with more than 12 months of service now have the ability to request conversion, or they must be offered conversion. So those are other obligations that came into effect more recently, different obligations for smaller and larger businesses, but all of them have that ability to request conversion. It doesn't mean they will be converted. It doesn't even mean they want to be converted, because conversion from casual to full-time or part-time employment normally comes with a 25% pay cut, but that seems to line up with that logic. So then what we can what we understand is that number changes without employer action don't impact on eligibility. So resignations, for example. So that could also be a way of, if you are wanting to terminate certain people, entering into a deed of release for a resignation instead. That could be a sneaky, or not sneaky, but a little trick that you might be able to do to not impact on your eligibility. Section 524 stand-down employees will also be included. So employees that are simply not working at the moment because there is no work, they will still count, but obviously that will also reduce your turnover figure, or that, should I say, your payrolls figure as well, in that regard. Andrew, just going to bring you in on this. So your understanding on the payroll is that it's based on the 40% of the payroll is based on the prospective payroll. Is that right?
Yes.
The payroll that's going, the 40% of the payroll is going ahead.
Yes. That's my understanding. It's based on the W1 in that they submit with the payroll.
Gotcha.
Makes sense.
Thanks, Andrew. Appreciate that. In terms of unanswered questions, so things that we're still not sure about, so performance management processes that are already underway. What if an employee is terminated for poor performance? Obviously, that's not something where you're looking at actively reducing your headcount. It's just reducing, or eliminating incompetence. So, that's when it's not clear whether or not that person would count or not. If there's a redundancy consultation process that's already underway, I mean, look, that's probably expired now, because most redundancy consultation processes normally take 7 to 14 days, and we're already 15 days after the cutoff, so probably not that much impact of that. Again, cases of serious misconduct. What if an employee is stealing in the workplace? Does that count as a reduction of their headcount? Employee hire offset. This is the other thing that we thought was a way not a way around this, but we thought this is an area that potentially would be permissible, where if an employee is terminated and replaced, well, then we would say that that's the same headcount. That's not a reduction in headcount. That's just one employee being swapped for another, essentially. The other question is, are all employees equal? So a casual working 5 hours a week, are they just equal to a single number? Or is there some sort of weighting on this? So we still don't know if that's how that works. I mean, I'm assuming they will all just count as numbers because you've got to nominate headcount, and that will include regular casuals. The other thing that could work in the favour of some businesses here is that you might have casuals who might have 10 months or 11 months service, and by the end of this application process, will have more than 12 months service. So you won't have to count them on the way in, but you'll be able to count them on the way out. So that could be another way of, particularly if you've got a larger workforce, that could be another way of maintaining or propping up your headcount. The other way of doing it is converting casuals with less than 12 months of employment to part-time or full-time employment. Even if you've reduced, hypothetically, if you had 20 employees, you made one employee redundant, but you had a casual employee who was, you nominated 20 on the application, you lost an employee for redundancy, so you had 19, and at the 11th hour before the headcount is reportable again, you convert a casual to part-time employment, which gets you back up to 20 without actually increasing any numbers. So that's another way potentially you might be able to work around it. The other question is this creating an incentive to delay performance management for underperforming staff? Well, potentially it is, depending upon the role, of course. Obviously, sales roles and things like that are going to be difficult in some industries at the moment because obviously sales are going to be hard to come by in some industries. In terms of delaying performance management more generally, I think the better strategy there, quite frankly, is to be terminating that employee and replacing that employee. That's probably the approach that you would take in that scenario. So I hope that kind of answers some of the employee-based questions around the eligibility and how that might play out in practicality. So we'll continue to move on through this. So look, I want to really open it up now for final questions. I mean, that's really all we wanted to cover today in this session. So I just wanted to kind of, again, put it out there that, on-demand HR, we've spent the last few weeks guiding our members through these considerations and adapting to their circumstances as a first priority. We have essential support membership available for businesses. Typically, this would suit a business of 10 employees or more. Typically, the things we would cover would include unlimited day-to-day advice on all of the things you see in that list there, and it's a very, very wide scope of things. The only things we don't include is basically employee claims and the Fair Work Commission and things like that, and recruitment, but everything else we basically can advise you on as part of a membership, which is unlimited. The other thing that we provide unlimited access to is our online training for employees and management. So we've got 6 different online training modules. Some of those are compliance-based, things like bullying, harassment, discrimination training, social media training, manual handling training, working from home training. Some of them are management training based, so things like interviewing training, learning about leave entitlements, and performance management training and the like. So we've got that all part of our on-demand HR membership arrangements. Our membership arrangements are very different from other players in the marketplace. We cover a much wider range of things. We offer training, which most, or I don't think any of the others do. And typically our minimum terms for membership would be either 3 or 6 months. But again, that's a lot shorter than what you would expect with other organisations. So if anyone has any further questions, I'm happy to take them. Now. Alternatively, the other option is to essentially send us a request to advice@ondemandhr.com.au, and we'll be quite happy to respond in that regard. So I'd like to take this opportunity to really thank everyone for coming along today. Thank you for your continued support of On-Demand HR's webinars. We try to provide informative updates on these things for people to use. We very much value our accounting networks in particular, who have been fantastic for us in the last 11 years, and hope you guys are getting a lot out of your associate membership with us. The other thing for any business that's interested in obviously establishing a supporter membership arrangement with us, please let us know, and please feel free to make an inquiry, and we'll be happy to assist you with this. We've got a team of 6 consultants now. We're all based in New South Wales, but we do have clients that are in Victoria and in Queensland. We've got subcontractors on the ground there should they ever need face-to-face support. So that's certainly something that we can help businesses with from time to time. Always happy for you to pick up the phone and give us a call to have a chat about anything. So yeah, I might leave it there. So if anyone's got any final questions, please let us know. I do have another question here. Are you okay with us sending out the link to EAP for all of our staff? Yes, that's another thing that is included in our memberships, is that we have access to employee assistance programs facilitated through a third party, which will cost you no money to access. It's only a pay-as-you-go scenario. Most definitely, Cassie, we can organise that for you. Happy for you to send out that link to everyone as part of your membership with us. So feel free to go ahead. Thank you. I've got another question here from Judy. If clients report GST on a cash basis, am I correct that they need to use cash method payment receipt instead of accrual invoice method to calculate turnover? Andrew, do you have any views on that particular question from Judy?
Yeah, not explicitly stated in the rules, but that would be my assumption too. It's basically how my assumption would be how they're reporting their GST would be the same methodology for calculating eligibility. So that would be my best guess. But again, it's a little bit challenging. We're not accountants, but that's how I read it.
Got a question here from Maria as well. Oh, is it Maria? Yes, it is Maria. Thank you for the question. What happens if staff need guidance and can't work remotely? We have a mixture, some working from home because they can work independently, but have a few, 15% in the office because they need constant monitoring and help. This is one of those real grey areas. I had a very similar situation with another client the other day where they had a brand new customer service team coming into their organisation. And this customer service team, theoretically, you would argue a customer service role, should be able to be done from home. It's administrative. It's picking up the phone. They have the systems to do it. But then the question is, if it's a brand new person, well, then is there an argument for them to come to the office because of the supervision component? I think this is a real tough one, Maria, because there's 2 arguments. One argument is they need to come in because they need the supervision, guidance, and support. The anti-argument is that why can't the supervision, guidance, and support be provided by Zoom, be provided by telephone? That's the challenge. Is that I take the view that if you got a visit from New South Wales Police, and they said, why have you got these people working in the office? You would say, well, they're new, they need supervision, they need guidance. They would say, well, what's their job? And you'd have to justify why they have to do the work in the office and why the guidance and couldn't be provided remotely. So I do feel that's a very tough scenario. And again, it might be one of those scenarios where you make a business decision. Do we simply go with it and take the view that, well, look, the situation is such that if we get a visit, we're just going to say that they're brand new employees, they can't work independently as yet. And by the way, police officer, everyone who can work independently, we've sent home. I think the other thing that will be important in this, if you do get a visit from police, I think it'll be important to show what you've done in an overall organisation context. So I think if you've sent most of your employees home, but you've got a couple in the office or on the site, I think that you've probably got a pretty good argument that you've considered it carefully and you've figured out that some employees simply can't work from home. So I think all of those factors are in play when you come up with that answer. I'm sorry I can't be more definitive than that, Maria, but I think it's a tough one. I think it depends what you're doing with everyone else, and it depends whether there's an argument that they have to be on the site or not. I've got a question here from Diane again. Broker gets paid 2 months in arrears, so it's being paid in July will not be paid till September. DAS is on cash basis, not being able to work most of this month. He's saying we need to report turnover as cash basis or business packages. Again, I might default that one to you, Andrew. Maybe you can pick that up on the chat box on that one. I might move on to Craig's question.
That one I'll come back to Diane on.
Decided they don't want to work as they can receive the government payment. Yeah, I think that's probably one that requires a bit more thought there, Diane. Thanks for that question. Got a comment here down the bottom. We had a police visit. They were quite reasonable. We had some at home, some in office on a rotation basis. They were okay with that. So okay, that's good, Diane. That's good feedback. Appreciate that you tell us that, because that gives us an insight into how they are enforcing it. So Diane, you were saying that we've had a police visit. They were quite reasonable. So Diane, I believe you're running an accounting office you were talking about there. We had some at home, some in the office. They advised it was on a rotation basis. They were okay as long as social distancing, masks and QR check-in. So that's good to know. Craig's question, we have a lot of casuals and many have decided they don't want to work as they can receive the government payment. We haven't stood them down. They're still employed, ready to return when they feel like it, but not working. Are they part of the headcount? Well, this is interesting. I mean, I guess the question is, do you have work for them or not? So I think it's the first question is, do we have work for them right now or not? You're saying they don't want to work, so presumably you do have work for them and they don't want to do that work. So the first question there is whether or not they've lost the hours. Have they really lost the hours or not? I mean, if they're electing to not go to work, well, then the question is, have they lost the hours or not? And I would argue they haven't, because if you're offering the hours and they're just not taking them, well, that's different from not having the hours to offer them in the first place. So I would say, your question is more about the headcount. Your question is, are they part of the headcount for the purposes of this? I think that, I mean, obviously you want to minimise your headcount on the way in and maximise it on the way out for the purposes of the numbers. A casual who's saying that they don't want to work, do they go from being a regular casual to being an irregular casual? I think the answer to that is possibly. So I think that, I think, Craig, it probably goes to some of those interesting discussions we had with you last year about this, around at what point do we count a regular and systematic casual? Do we say that they've got to work 10 hours a week or more? When do they go from being regular to irregular? When do they go from being irregular to regular? So I think in this situation, if they're saying they don't want to work, if you've got the work available for them, then yeah, you could make the argument they're not regular and therefore they don't form part of the headcount. But just quickly, Andrew, on that point, is it that casuals with more than 12 months service regardless, or it's regular and systematic casuals with more than 12 months service?
They don't use the terminology regular and systematic. It's casuals that have been engaged for more than 12 months, or words to that effect is the actual terminology that they use. But I think in Craig's case, I think just similar to the discussions, Craig, that we had during the JobKeeper period, it's going to be down to the business to make a determination of this. I guess with all of these type of really grey areas, and not just in Craig's case, but in all of these really grey areas, I think ultimately the spirit of all of these is going to be, as we discovered on JobKeeper, to do the right thing and to do things to your best interest. So what I mean by that is, I think that in making, my gut would tell me, in making a determination that not to declare those employees as part of the headcount, well, I don't think that's an unreasonable assumption. And as we've discovered across the JobKeeper period, or through experience through JobKeeper, I guess there's no real ability to, audit this. You imagine from a government perspective to do this on scale. I think on the balance, I personally wouldn't be declaring them if they're not, if they're effectively terminating or resigning, if you like. You could form an argument that way too.
Yeah, I think we've got here another comment from Jitesh about depending upon what the government's going to do with public transport, saying that France is not going to allow non-vaccinated people to use public transport. I think watch that space, because I know that France, I think, were considering having those vaccination passports, which my personal opinion is a pretty crazy idea, but it'll be interesting to see how far this goes. I know that France at the moment in particular, I think they've changed their position on that based on political pressures and mass protesting in that regard. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in New South Wales or in Australia at large on that front. Another point that came up, just back on Maria's question about the whole working from home when there's a new starter. I think it's just a tough one. I understand that doing Zoom and telephone training might not be as good as doing face-to-face training. I guess the question is, again, Maria, what I would encourage you to do in that situation, probably taking from Diane's experience with this, is that as long as you can show that you're making an effort to have some employees work from home, I think you're fine. But I think if you're bringing every single employee in and saying, "Oh, sorry, no one can work from home," I think that's where you're going to come unstuck. So I think that if you have new staff that you must train and it must be done on the premises, as long as you've got other employees you can show are working from home and are working independently, you'll probably get away with it, I would say. And at the very least, at the very worst, you won't get a fine out of it. So that's, again, the sort of what we spoke about, the guiding principles at the start. I think forgiveness, not permission, is kind of the approach that we would take in these situations. And we really understand that, businesses can't necessarily afford to take how do I put this, just a not do things approach at the moment. I mean, really, if you look at it, the economic catastrophe that we've got right now, and I think these lockdowns are costing us, $1 billion a week for 7 deaths in 2021 in the whole of Australia. So you've got to wonder whether the economic catastrophe is worth it, whatever the so-called health benefit of this is. So that's very interesting. If there's any other questions, we're still happy to take them. We've still got some time here in the session right now, or alternatively, happy to take them offline. It's been a really interesting few weeks, and obviously there'll be a further update now as a result of today's announcements. As I understand it, the two headline announcements coming from the comments is that the increase from 10K to 100K for the business support, and the increase in the 3 extra LGAs. So we will certainly be continuing to update members. If there's anyone who's not on our distribution list and you want to get access to future webinars, please just email us at the advice@ondemandhr.com.au email. Andrew will add you to our list, and we will put you on for all of our future webinars that we have. So appreciate that. I might just do a last scan of the questions to see if there is anything else that we have missed throughout the session. Sorry, Diane, I know you asked a few very technical questions on the numbers. I wasn't able to answer all of those on the fly. Andrew is probably the best one to pick that up going forward. So the directors, where the directors are included and things like that. Scrolling through again. Looking at this, so obviously with the 3 extra LGAs, that's going to create a scenario where obviously more employees now will be restricted from coming to work unless they are authorised workers. So again, remember the word is authorised workers, not essential workers. Essential workers is this kind of just waffle term that's been just thrown around in the media. The real term that you need to be focused on is the employee an authorised worker as defined within the rules. So that's the key test, because basically, if you're not in an affected LGA, as long as if the work can't be done from home and you're not in an affected LGA, then it's open slather. You can do whatever you like. If you live in an area that's not an affected LGA, you do not have to be an authorised worker to go to the site, so long as the work can't be done from home. So that's important as well. Let's not confuse every other LGA in New South Wales with the 8 LGAs that are impacted. It's only the impacted where you've got to be authorised. Outside of the 8, you can go to work so long as the work can't be done from home. Very simple. Look, thanks so much for your time, everyone. Really appreciate your continued support of On Demand HR. I know today's been obviously a fiery session. I've had some strong views on the government and how they've handled this. I cannot help myself but really say how disappointing the planning has been in the restrictions. They've had a long time to work this out. Lockdowns and cases are not surprising, but what is surprising is the day-to-day changes in these LGAs. And we still don't have really even clarity on when does an LGA go from being, fine and dandy to being a so-called hotspot. And you look at interstate, and hotspots can be, according to some premiers, it could be 1 or 2 cases. in other people's views. I mean, these things, businesses have the right, I think, to have more certainty around these things. And I'll continue to advocate for businesses to get more clarity and better rules around these things because, as I said earlier in the presentation and in the webinar, it's not good enough that government just make this up as they go. Businesses need to have some expectation around what may happen next before it happens, not just this complete surprise after surprise after surprise. So thank you for being patient with me on that. I hope that you've learned a lot out of today's session. We might leave it there. I'll do a last check of the Q&A, but if there's no other questions, we might leave it there. Thank you so much. I wish you guys all the very best for the coming weeks. I know these are going to be difficult times for a number of different industries, particularly hospitality, some retail, and those sorts of things. Hopefully, these lockdowns will be ended soon enough so that people can get on with living their ordinary lives. And we'll certainly keep you updated should anything significant happen.